do I mean what to do when perspective theory doesn't help? Isn't that the point? That it always helps? That if we understand it, we can understand what's happening with the lines in what's in front of us more easily, and therefore we can draw them more accurately, more easily as well. Well, yes, that's still fundamentally true. But believe it or not, sometimes perspective theory is not particularly helpful when we look at a scene. What about this scene? With all of these lines and angles going off in all different directions, none of which seem to converge anywhere or at any one level, how on earth do we work out how perspective applies to this? In a moment, I'll draw this scene and explain exactly what to do when perspective theory doesn't seem to be very helpful. And after I've done the demo drawing, I'll look at this reference again and make a few points about how we can still see the perspective principles that we know and love at work here, even if they're not very helpful in actually drawing this scene. But let's start the drawing. I'm using a 0.2 millimeter pen at this point, just getting some lighter lines. I bounce between really 0.2 and 0.3 in this. Now, as I said, what do we do if we're not thinking perspective theory, if we're not trying to imagine where the eye level, or you might call it less helpfully, the horizon is? We're not looking for vanishing points. What do? Well, we do what is always open as an option for us in any drawing where we have a reference in front of us, whether it's a photo or an actual scene, and that's we observe carefully. We look carefully at lines, at angles, at the shapes that they create. We draw through negative and positive space. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm establishing these very strong angles on the left-hand side, and then I'm drawing the lampposts, positioning the lampposts to create the shapes, hopefully in roughly approximate proportions that we have. And now I'm adding another line for the top of that building on the left-hand side. Also looking at the shape it creates, checking my angles. Now, this isn't going to be a highly detailed drawing. I'm not going to, for instance, try and put the bricks on that wall because I do intend to use marker to add the fairly strong and quite dramatic shadows, which I think are important and interesting part of this scene. So I'm looking at the shapes, and now I'm trying to create the shapes by drawing the lines around them that will make the shapes happen, keeping the angles the same. Now I do decide on the right hand side here to make these lines vertical, rather than have the distortion that the camera has put in them. So trying to work out exactly where these lines are now that I'm not exactly following my photo. But of course, in the end, what I want is for my drawing to look consistent with what we would expect to see, because we won't be comparing it to the reference. So having established this gap between the two, and you can see I do a lot of alignment. You can see that I draw a lot of horizontal lines sometimes on the reference to check lining up the details on the right-hand side with details I've already drawn on the left-hand side. So where corners line up with other corners, are they above or below? And then I can move slowly, just checking the proportions as I go. Getting the main structural lines of this scene, if you like, in place, and then adding the details. Because there aren't many details in this scene, there's a lot of very bold, large areas, then this certainly is the sort of drawing where defining the large areas first is a fairly helpful thing to do. It's not necessarily the way I would normally work on some of my more detailed architectural drawings. But I think in the end, the answer is it's not that we have a system that is our system that we always use, but that we always choose the technique, the drawing strategy that's going to be most helpful for us to draw the particular scene in front of us. And so I've come down to the bottom of the stairs, and this arch leads to a road that then goes under the bridge that we see to the right. A lot of lines there to do nothing more than make a mess of what was already there. I don't know why I did those lines at all. So now there are some decorations, some obelisk structures on each side of this bridge that goes over a street that's actually cut into a headland. The headland that the harbour bridge sits on. And so this was a very early excavation when Sydney was founded, and greatly reduced the travel time between the two sides of Sydney Cove. So now I do these stairs and I make them too exaggerated in terms of them becoming smaller as they move further away. And I try and come back from that when I put the tone, the value on top of them. I don't line up with the lines I've drawn, but I line up with how I wish the lines had been drawn. And then now looking at some of the detail, the foreshortening on this road, this bridge that goes across the road. And now I'm putting this lamp in. With these sorts of things, I like to position the end result, which in this case is the lamp on the end, and then draw the attachment between the pole and the lamp. That way I find that my lamps end up in the right place. Not that I did a great job of that, but I must admit I wasn't overly fussed because I know that it's going to have a lot of dark value behind it with those dark bushes on the other side of the road, which I know I'm going to be doing fairly dark with my marker. So having just by careful observation, by looking at shapes, at angles, at the forms that are created, I've done my best to copy this. Now I start with an N4 down here, and that's N for neutral grey in the Copic sketch markers, and I'm using the brush end. I start with an N4 because that's a good mid-tone in terms of the range that I use. I don't usually go beyond an N6 because I find N7, N8, N9, N10, they all just photograph black the same as N6 basically does. So there's not a great deal of value when I'm recording to use those darker tones. And so my expectation at this point is that most of this is going to be N3, N4, N5, or left white. There's just a very few spots where I put some N2, and otherwise that was the case. So N6 for the roadway that we're seeing through the tunnel, N6 for the black lamps and the handrails, and back to N4 at this point. And now I'm using an N5, starting to define the value for these trees on the other side of the road, but relatively close. But then we also have some trees further in the distance on the other side of the road, but being seen over the top of that bridge. So I switched to an N3 now for the side of the stairway that's in shade and that's casting a slight shadow. There's obviously one of these lamps overhead that we can't see, but the shadow is being cast. And so now playing just with value, defining this lamp, which I'm going to let become a little more prominent, a little more high contrast with the background than is in the reference, just for a bit of interest up in that section. The artist is always free to do what they want. Now here I'm doing the balusters for this balustrade. If you have trouble with this, then watch what I do. Maybe slow down this section, rewind it and slow down. It's a great example of drawing the effect of detail, not drawing the detail. I mean, obviously it was very quick, sped up, but it really just took 2 minutes in life to do. And I think it's a very credible representation without actually sitting there and drawing everyone baluster by baluster, which is what the individual vertical posts of a balustrade are called. So I've gone back with my pen just to create a little more definition, a little more texture in the trees behind. Now I switched that wall to a N5. I decided it wasn't dark enough. I put N6 along the inside of the gutter, and now there's N6 on the bush behind, and now I rearrange my N5s and some N4 and generally just adjusting the values one darker in quite a lot of places. So going over this shade in N3, and then I come back at this with my N4 and I make it darker in this bottom section where there's less light bouncing around. There's more light just bouncing off the hot light concrete on the right hand side, bouncing across to the left hand side. That's hitting the upper part really above the rail, and so it gives the effect of lighter shade. And so to represent that, I thought I'd maybe have I done it by now already? Put the darker value closer to the steps. Still playing with this foliage. I don't want this foliage to take a lot of time. It's really about the other parts of it, the architecture. And then it's time to take off the strips, which I do badly, and tear the paper 3 times. Don't you love that? Fortunately, it's not a commission. And here we have this section of our drawing done. What do you think? Let me come back to our original drawing and see, where does perspective operate here? Well, firstly, let's find eye level. Now, eye level is where the perspective angles join. But which angles are we talking about when there are so many angles going off in so many different directions? Well, let's take some more obvious ones. Let's look at these lines here. And they join there. Let's look at these lines here. And they join here. Well, we have a brick wall here, so let's use the bricks on this wall because they're parallel to each other on the same plane. And they join there. And let's get one more pair of lines that we can see up here. So we have a mark here, we have a mark here, we have a mark here, and we have a mark here. And do they line up in a straight line? Pretty close. In fact, if we put the straight line between them, they're more than close enough that any slight inaccuracies are explained simply by these are not great edges and may not be perfectly parallel or horizontal in our view. And so eye level is going to be about here. And that looks pretty right when we actually look at these stairs, which give us a good sense of where eye level is, because eye level is where we stop seeing the treads that we're looking down on and we see the steps straight on. And I reckon this is the step we're looking straight on. That step, or maybe it's the one above it. And above that, we can see that the risers, the vertical part, becomes slightly narrower as we start to see it from underneath, and part of our view of each riser becomes obscured from the step beneath. So if we're thinking of eye level being about here, and we look at these lines here, then we can see, in fact, that they're going to join a long way off the page. And I actually suspect that we would be better off aligning our eye level here with the stairs, which would just give a little more downward tilt to this line. And I think we can see these meeting well off the page to the right. And in a similar way, this line, which is horizontal to the ones above, also will join these lines crossing our eye level line. So what about this down here, where this looks like we have 1 point perspective? If we join up all of these lines, they approximately align. And I think the problem with this is that it just looks very similar to 1 point perspective videos and the diagrams they often present of looking straight up a street or straight up a railway line. But the vanishing point is always on eye level. And we can see that all the horizontal lines that we have do meet up on eye level. In fact, this guttering, which does line up parallel on the horizontal to these brick courses, also meets at the same spot. So of course, perspective theory still operates in this scene. But my point is that it's fairly confusing to find. There are some red herrings that could lead us astray, and we have lots of angles that simply aren't connected with the same patterns of other lines. But of course, having a basic understanding of perspective can be a real help in us understanding what we're looking at more easily. And the more easily we understand what we're actually seeing, then the easier it's going to be to accurately draw it. But perspective theory is in the end just another tool that the artist has at their disposal. And sometimes it may not be the best tool to do a job. Sometimes a more fundamental tool, such as careful observation, ends up being the most straightforward way to go and a very effective way of getting a reasonable result. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this view really interesting, and I hope you want to have a go drawing it, and of course I'll post this on my channel community page. But I hope I've also made the point that while I'm obviously a great fan of understanding how perspective works, it still is just a means to an end. And it's not necessarily the best way in a given subject to be thinking to get the best result. In the end, we're the artists. We get to choose how we think, how we understand our scene, and the process by which we draw it. But look, whatever you're drawing and however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.